Hello. This week's Torah portion, Vayera, relates the story of when Abraham came close to sacrificing his son Isaac on God's command as a test of faith. The Torah says in Genesis, "And it came to pass that God tested Abraham and said to him, 'Abraham,' and he said, 'Behold, here I am.' And he said, 'Take now your son, your only son, Isaac, the one you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains which I will tell you.'" Unquote. Abraham proceeds as told, but at the last minute, God stops Abraham right before Isaac is about to be killed. This is a strange and disturbing story. It is called the Akedah, or binding of Isaac. It raises many questions. There's no reference to it anywhere else in the Tanakh or the Bible. Why, if it's such a defining moment in the history of Judaism? There are no lessons specifically tied to the Akedah. It's just there. What are we supposed to make of it? First, we are told that God tested Abraham. So we ask, did Abraham pass the test? The traditional answer is, of course, yes. The Torah says, "And God said, 'Do not lay your hand upon the lad, nor do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, seeing that you did not withhold your son, your only son, from me.'" So, since Abraham was willing to sacrifice what he loved most, as a sign of submission to God's will no matter what, as a sign of faith, he must have passed the test. But there are clues in our tradition to suggest that in some respects, Abraham failed the test. First, he did not ask questions or protest. Now, previously in the Torah, we hear Abraham arguing strenuously with God that Sodom should not be destroyed. He extracts a promise from God that Sodom will not be destroyed if 10 righteous people are found there. So Abraham has a record of arguing with God, but here he did not argue. Second, right after this story, the Midrash tells us that Isaac's mother, Sarah, died of grief when she heard that Abraham had sacrificed Isaac. Third, the Talmud records a tradition that patriarchs followed Jewish law, halakha, even before the Torah was given to all. Because the Torah itself says, "Because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws," implying Abraham was following the Torah. Well, one of the most loathsome practices outlawed by halakha is child sacrifice. So Abraham wasn't supposed to obey because God's instruction was against halakha. Now, to counter this argument, the Talmud asserts the right of a prophet to suspend a law. That's in Tractate Sanhedrin. So they argue even murder would have been permissible to Abraham as an established prophet, if that was really God's will. Fourth, Abraham was never spoken to by God again after the Akedah. Rabbi Shlomo Riskin explains that this was because God was unhappy with Abraham for being eager to obey the command to slaughter Isaac. The Hasidic masters also say that the Akedah was punishment for Abraham's mistreatment of his elder son Ishmael, whom he expelled from his households. As Abraham failed to show compassion for his first son, so God punished him by ostensibly failing to show compassion for Abraham's second son. There are other views. One is that Abraham was stalling and never intended to kill his son. At the last second, he would have stopped his own hand if God hadn't done it. So Abraham was, in a sense, also testing God. He and God were engaged in a game of chicken. What evidence do we have for that? Well, we read about Abraham's actions, but we don't know his thoughts. He takes his time, he cuts the wood slowly, he loads his animals slowly, he plods slowly towards the mountains. He hopes that God will intercede. He never means to kill Isaac. That's why he told his servants, quote, "The boy and I will worship and return to you," unquote. Another view is that God never intended to let Abraham actually sacrifice Isaac. The book of Jeremiah says, quote, "And they have built high places to burn their sons and their daughters in the fire, which I did not command them, nor did it enter my mind that they should do this," unquote. Rashi interprets this verse as God saying, "Don't think for a moment that I ever had any intention of actually having Abraham kill his son. That never even occurred to me." Also, the Torah says, quote, "So Abraham returned to his young men, and they rose up and went together to Beersheba." So Abraham returned together with the young men who accompanied him, but nothing is said of Isaac. Abraham ibn Ezra from 12th century Spain records an opinion, not his, that Isaac was killed by Abraham, then resurrected. But Ibn Ezra himself rejects that view. Many observations and questions have been put forth on the Akedah. Here are some of them. First, the Akedah refers to Jewish martyrdom. The Jewish people must be ready at all times to give up life itself for the sake of the sanctification of the divine name, the Kiddush Hashem. Second, if you place yourself or your children in harm's way for a higher cause, for example, by going to war, going on a risky mission, or just living in anti-Semitic societies, are you not doing essentially what Abraham did? The Talmud tells the story of a woman who had 7 sons. All 7 were tortured to death rather than bow to an idol as commanded. Quote, "She said to her last son before he was killed, 'My son, go and say to your father Abraham, you did bind one of your sons on the altar, but I have bound all 7 of my sons to 7 altars.'" Unquote. Was this different from the Akedah? To this one may answer, yes, because we see a purpose. Did Abraham see a purpose? Third, does God really test us all the time? The book of Job elaborates on that. Is our evil inclination, our Yetzer Hara, a perpetual test? Fourth, Abraham was just following orders. Is that okay? Fifth, how did Abraham know it was really God making this demand? How would anyone ever know? Sixth, why is such a premium placed on faith without proof, when we were given a mind that asks for proof? Seventh, Maimonides, in his Guide for the Perplexed, says, quote, "God tested Abraham does not mean that God put Abraham through a test, but that God made the example of Abraham serve as a test case of the extreme limits of the love and fear of God." Eighth, the shofar, or ram's horn, is to remind us of the ram that was substituted for Isaac at the last minute. The story of the Akedah is always read on Rosh Hashanah. Finally, the sages tell us that Isaac was really a grown man, strong enough to prevent the elderly Abraham from tying him up if he had wanted to resist. Why didn't he resist? The point is that the story isn't called the testing of Abraham. It's called the binding of Isaac. So we must focus on Isaac's acceptance. Perhaps that is the lesson of the Akedah. Acceptance of bad things, after doing all we can to avoid them, in spite of not understanding the reasons, with faith that in some mysterious fashion it's all for the best, and moving on with our lives to build a better tomorrow. Shabbat Shalom.